how do you think that the Delta Airlines lawsuit against Microsoft and CrowdStrike will impact the tech industry, especially in terms of accountability for service disruptions?
Yeah, I have pretty strong opinions about it. In fact, I posted when this all happened with CrowdStrike. I remember I was in Europe at the time, so I was awake when it first happened. And whereas in the U.S., it kind of happened overnight in the U.S. So I posted on LinkedIn sort of a not a snarky comment, but basically just sharing the article that had just broken or the news that had just broke at the time about the outage. And I just basically said this is why this is the dark side of the cloud, basically, or in dark side of over dependence on vendor lock. Basically you're too dependent on one software vendor. What happens when that one software vendor has a problem? And they're all going to have problems. I mean, and I'm not here to argue whether or not we should be moving to the cloud or not, or whether or not we need to be leveraging outside third-party software vendors. Of course we do. But my beef with this whole industry right now is that we don't need to be doubling down on single vendors. There's no reason why you should put all your eggs in one basket, because things like this will happen. And I remember one of the comments on LinkedIn when I posted this, someone made a comment of like, well, this is just the way it is. It's like saying that because your car broke down, you should go back to the horse and buggy. And my point was, and so I responded, I got into a bit of a debate with this person on LinkedIn. I said, well, I'm not saying go back to the horse and buggy. You might need to have the horse and buggy as a backup though, if your car breaks down, or you need to have something. And by the way, we're not talking about a car breaking down. We're talking about millions of cars breaking down all at the same time. That would be catastrophic in the world if that happened, if none of us could drive anywhere because we had some sort of cloud-based transportation that didn't allow us to go anywhere. That would be catastrophic. And so we probably wouldn't do that. So why are we doing that in the technology space here, where we're sort of investing too much or too heavily, in my opinion, to basically lock into one vendor? And so, it sounds like Delta is saying, hey, we're sort of rethinking that approach and being too dependent on one vendor. And, I think there's going to be a lot more of this. I mark my word, in the next few years, there's going to be a lot more of this dark side of the cloud that is going to materialize, and it's going to cause big problems. And I know people don't like when I say it because it sort of counters the sales messaging of the industry. The sales messaging in the industry is cloud is great. Cloud is perfect. Cloud delivers all this ROI. It's better than any, we can deliver services and software better than any mom and pop internal IT department can. That is true, but there's also a downside risk, and organizations haven't yet seen the downside risk, except for companies like Delta and others that have been affected by this particular situation. But there'll be more. I mean, there's going to be more. Some big software vendor at some point is going to have a big cyber attack again, and it's going to bring down the systems of thousands or tens of thousands of companies across the world, and it's going to cause a big disruption. And we're going to be sitting here having this conversation again. So this won't be the last time, but I just think that organizations don't need to deviate from the cloud. Of course, you need to keep investing in cloud and technologies and all that stuff, but I think organizations should be a lot smarter and not doubling down on this just on one single technology.
That makes sense. In your opinion, Eric, who should bear the responsibility for the large scale outages? Should it be the software providers, or should it be the company using the software? Or like you said, should companies really make sure that they have that backup plan then?
It's a good question. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, so I can't speak to the contractual piece of it that you were alluding to when you were describing the situation. But I would think in this case, you look to where did the problem start? The problem started with CrowdStrike, but Microsoft hired CrowdStrike to provide this piece of security as part of the Microsoft solution. So it was like a breakdown on two layers there. I mean, CrowdStrike should have never delivered a faulty security patch or whatever it was. But at the same time, Microsoft should have been smart enough to test and make sure that they were accountable for what they're delivering to the customers. Because the customers are hiring Microsoft. They weren't hiring, from what I understand, they weren't hiring or leveraging CrowdStrike software directly. They were doing it as part of a broader Microsoft solution. So ultimately, I think it's going to come down to Microsoft. I think Microsoft is probably the one that's going to bear the brunt of the legal bullseye and lawsuits and all that stuff, partially because of what I just said, but also partially because Microsoft probably has deeper pockets, I'm assuming, than CrowdStrike. So I imagine the lawsuits will probably target Microsoft for those two reasons. But again, I'm not an attorney, but I think that tech companies just need to do a better job and be less flippant about how their work day to day affects companies. And I think this is a good example of how we're not just talking about technology here. We're talking about people's lives and society and the world functioning, and therefore these big tech providers have they bear a larger responsibility, and the consequences are much higher. The stakes are much higher now when their software fails.
Yeah. Can you share any similar experiences that you've had throughout your career where there was a major outage that led to significant changes on how a company is managing their technology?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I've never seen anything on this scale in my career. Partially because up until 5 or 10 years ago, everything was on prem, and if there was an outage, it was only affecting it was affecting a very small subset of the world. You didn't have these big, massive cloud failures affecting all these different companies, or even like cybersecurity hacks. You look at all these different big cloud providers that are housing social security numbers or credit card numbers for millions of customers throughout the world, and then that cloud system gets hacked, and now all of a sudden hundreds of millions of credit card numbers are out there floating around. That just didn't happen up until 10 years ago because you didn't have the cloud solutions. You only had these smaller, decentralized, fragmented on-premise systems. So the stakes were lower and the consequences were lower when something did happen. Having said that, though, I have seen organizations that have struggled with the system going down or breaking, and it can be really disruptive. I mean, particularly because what we deal with most of the time is back end or back office ERP systems. And when an ERP system goes down, you can't ship product, you can't close the books, you can't run your payroll. There's so much stuff that breaks. And what ends up happening is the organizations revert into full on manual mode, pen and paper, spreadsheets, emails, and then they try to clean it up later when the system's back and running. They try to re-enter all that data back in the system. So it's super messy. I don't know, the best way to work around it, in my opinion, is to not put all your eggs in one basket and make sure you've got multiple technologies, and that's a strong case for best of breed. If you have multiple systems doing different things, imagine if just one part of your organization goes down instead of the entire organization. And that's the way you have to think about it: is what's the risk if my entire ERP system goes down, gets hacked, just stops working because of something like a CrowdStrike happening again? What are the consequences, and what am I going to do? And so, you've got to have a backup plan or sort of a recovery plan, but you also need to think, do I really want my entire operation running on this one platform where if something goes wrong, my entire business shuts down? Or do I want to hedge a little bit and diversify some of that risk and have multiple systems? Creates other technical issues, of course. There's integration issues, things like that, but you've got to weigh the risk reward of both scenarios. And I think just organizations just need to be open-minded about that, and not so myopic about we need one single cloud system and that's going to be our entire ERP system. That might be the right answer for some, but it doesn't necessarily need to be.